With permission, Mr. Speaker, I would like to make a statement about the number of migrants trying to cross the English Channel in small boats and what the government is doing in response. But before that, I know that the whole House will want to join me in sending our thoughts and prayers to those injured in the attack at Manchester's Victoria Station on New Year's Eve, and to all those affected by this cruel and senseless act. I would also like to thank the emergency services for their courageous response. Thankfully, Mr. Speaker, there were no fatalities, and I'm pleased to say that all 3 victims have now been discharged from hospital. Mr. Speaker, let me now turn to the issue of English Channel migrant crossings. Over recent weeks, we saw a sharp increase in the number of migrants attempting to cross the Channel to the UK in small boats. Over 500 migrants, mostly Iranian, attempted to travel to the UK on small vessels in 2018. 80% of them attempted this in the last 3 months of the year. Around 40% of the attempts were either disrupted by French law enforcement or returned to France via French agencies. Since the 1st of January, a further 25 have attempted to cross the Channel, but they were disrupted. In addition, just this morning, a dinghy was discovered along the Kent coast. A number of individuals are now going through UK immigration procedures, and 1 person has been arrested. Mr. Deputy Speaker, I'm sure the House will want to join me in thanking all the law enforcement agencies and all those involved in the response for their tireless efforts over Christmas and the New Year. This includes Border Force, Immigration Enforcement, the Coast Guard, the National Crime Agency and the RNLI, many of whom I met in Dover last week. I would also like to thank our French law enforcement partners for their efforts to date, which have been collaborative, swift and thorough. The English Channel contains some of the busiest shipping lanes in the world. The weather conditions are often treacherous, and the inflatable boats that are being used are woefully ill-equipped to make such dangerous journeys. The migrants who choose to make the trip are putting their lives in grave danger and can, at times, also create dangerous situations for our rescue services. The reasons behind the increased crossings are diverse and in many cases are outside our control. First, instability in the regions such as the Middle East and North Africa are driving people out of their homes in search of better lives in Europe. Second, organised crime groups are preying on and profiting from these vulnerable and often desperate people. They are falsely promising them safe crossings to the UK, even though the journey is one of the most hazardous and the most dangerous possible. Third, strengthened security at the French-UK border has meant that it has become increasingly difficult for stowaways to illegally enter the UK in trucks and cars, leading to more reckless attempts by boat. I've been very clear that robust action is needed to protect people, our borders, and to deter illegal migration. Over the festive period, I took the decision to declare the situation a major incident. I appointed a dedicated Gold Command and I stepped up the UK's response. As part of joint action agreed with the French, I have ordered 2 UK Border Force boats to be redeployed from overseas to patrol the Channel. This is in addition to the 2 already undertaking enhanced patrols in these waters. This will mean 4 Border Force cutters in total. And this is in addition to the 2 coastal patrol vessels currently operating and aerial surveillance of the area. Last week, I also requested additional help from the Ministry of Defence while we await the return of the 2 boats currently overseas. I'm grateful that the Royal Navy has kindly offered to the use of HMS Mersey, which started patrols on Friday. I'm also continuing to discuss with the French what more that they can do to stop people from attempting to make these crossings from France in the first place. I welcome the action plan that the French have outlined just this Friday, which includes a commitment to increase surveillance and security in maritime areas, prevention campaigns in French coastal areas to stop people from setting off in the boats in the first place, and a reinforced fight against smuggling gangs. I'm also pleased to say that the National Crime Agency has also redoubled its efforts. Just last week, 2 men were arrested on suspicion of illegal movement of migrants. In addition, We're doing important work in the home countries of the would-be migrants to reduce factors which would compel them to make these dangerous journeys in the first place. So, for example, we're helping to create jobs, to build infrastructure, tackling modern slavery, providing education, and delivering life-saving humanitarian assistance in response to conflicts and natural disasters. We're also doing important work to undermine organised crime groups. And we've committed £2.7 billion to the humanitarian response in Syria, making us the second biggest bilateral donor to the region. We are also on track to resettle 20,000 refugees fleeing the conflict in Syria by 2020, as well as up to 3,000 of the most vulnerable people from the Middle East and North Africa, including children at risk of exploitation and abuse. And in 2017, the UK resettled more refugees under national resettlement schemes than any other EU state. So let me reassure the House that I am continuing to monitor the issue of channel crossings daily. Right honourable and honourable members will know that these crossings have also provoked a debate. But I'm not afraid to say that I think that there are some legitimate questions that need to be asked. Why, for instance, are so many people choosing to cross the Channel from France to the UK when France itself is a safe country? The widely accepted international principle is that those seeking asylum should claim it in the first safe country that they reach, be that France or elsewhere. Indeed, many asylum seekers do just this. And domestic legislation from 2004 clearly states that if an individual travels through a safe third country and fails to claim asylum, it will be taken into account in assessing the credibility of their claim. And following these recent events, I've instructed my officials to look at how we can tighten this still further and ensure that these provisions are working effectively. Mr. Deputy Speaker, Britain has a proud tradition of welcoming and protecting asylum seekers. We also have a long history of accepting economic migrants too, people like my very own parents. But all these routes need to be safe and they need to be controlled. Getting in a rubber dinghy is not. That is why I will not accept these channel crossings as just a matter of a fact of life. Safeguarding lives and protecting the UK border are crucial Home Office priorities. And whilst we have obligations to genuine asylum seekers and we will uphold them, we will not stand by and allow reckless criminals to take advantage of vulnerable people. Encouraging people to dangerously cross the Channel to come here is not an act of compassion. So I will continue to do all I can to stop these dangerous crossings. I commend this statement to the House.
Shadow Home Secretary Diana Hunt.
Thank you, Mr. Deputy Speaker. I'd like to thank the Home Secretary for prior sight of his statement. And on this side of the House, we join him in sending our thoughts and prayers to those injured in the attack at Manchester Victoria Station and to thank the emergency services for their courage. Does the Home Secretary share my concern that we should be careful not to heighten a potentially toxic atmosphere around migration as the Brexit debate reaches its climax? However, the whole House agrees that the public deserves assurance that our borders are secure. Nobody in this House believes that these crossings should be just a fact of life, not least because these desperate people are putting their lives into terrible danger. But is he aware that his predecessor, the then Home Secretary Theresa May, took the decision in 2012 to scrap an aerial surveillance programme of the entire coastline, presumably because of the dictates of austerity? Does he accept that this decision left us, in the words of the then Security Minister Dame Pauline Neville-Jones, more naked than we would otherwise have been, and that we are now scrambling to catch up by using the armed forces? The Home Secretary knows that a little over 200 people arrived here crossing the Channel in the entire final 3 months of last year. One migrant making that dangerous crossing is one too many. But does he appreciate that some people might think that describing this as a major incident is possibly an overstatement when you consider that at the height of the Mediterranean crisis, Greece was seeing hundreds of people a day landing on its beaches. The Home Secretary is correct to make the point about the risks to human life. We know that ruthless people smugglers put desperate people in unseaworthy craft with no one on board who's any type of seaman, and they distribute fake life jackets. And all this in the busiest shipping lanes in the world. These people smugglers are people putting people's lives at risk for mere financial gain. However, does the Home Secretary accept that there can be no question of turning back asylum seekers who have reached British waters? That would be to put this country outside international law. And can I also remind the Home Secretary, in this country we do operate under the rule of law, and in this case we are bound by the 1951 Convention relating to the status of refugees. Does the Home Secretary accept that under the Convention, of which we are a signatory, refugees do have a right to seek asylum here? Taking the failure to claim in the first safe country into account is one thing. Claiming that it entirely nullifies the asylum claim is quite wrong. Refugees may have cultural, family or language reasons to claim in this country, and does he understand that it is not for him as Home Secretary or anyone else to claim that someone is not a genuine refugee without examining their case? I welcome the increased cooperation with the French and the French action plan outlined on Friday, because the important thing is not bellicose statements, but to stop people making these dangerous crossings in the first place. I turn now to the issue of the deployment of the Royal Navy. It seems to some the Home Secretary is in some type of competition with the Defence Secretary as to who can appear more bellicose towards these groups of Iranian refugees in their rubber dinghies. But serious questions arise. What will be the total cost to the Home Office from this deployment, and how will it be funded? What will be the cost per person rescued? How many of the people smugglers have been prevented and detained? And what of the operations that were taking place in the Mediterranean and have apparently now been suspended? Can the Home Secretary explain what contingency measures have been put in place so as not to leave a gaping hole in these existing coordinated rescue and interdiction efforts? Please tell the House that all of these issues have been considered, have been addressed, are in hand. Otherwise, unkind people might be forced to conclude that this major incident had little to do with a national crisis, but more to do with positioning for the forthcoming Tory leadership battle.
Home Secretary.
Thank you, Mr. Deputy Speaker. Can I thank the Right Honourable Lady for her comments, and let me take this opportunity to wish her and her team a happy New Year. Now, she raised a number of points. Let me try to tackle them in order. This has nothing to do with the Brexit debate or the legitimate debate that is taking on around Brexit on future immigration and all those related issues. This is all about protecting our borders and protecting human life, dealing with a situation here and now, and that's all it should be about. She mentioned, the Right Honourable Lady mentioned the previous Home Secretary, now the Prime Minister. In fact, when she was Home Secretary, she did a great deal to deal with illegal migration, and especially in relation to from France. So, for example, the Sandhurst Agreement, when the whole work on that was initiated both by her originally as Home Secretary, then continued by her as Prime Minister. And as I mentioned in my statement, there is some evidence, as it's become harder on some other routes for people to enter the UK by clandestine means, maybe on ferry, on train, on cars, they are turning to more dangerous routes, and that's why why we need to address those as well. She questioned as to whether this should have been designated a major incident. Well, let me just say two brief things on that. I mean, first of all, there's been a significant increase on the number of crossings through this method, through small boats across the English Channel. As I said, 543 attempts in 2018, not all successful, 40% of them roughly disrupted, but 80% of those taking place in the last 3 months, particularly in the month of December. So there's a definite trend of increase there, and it needs to be dealt with as quickly as possible so it doesn't get completely out of control. Now, she may think, and maybe it's suggested through her question, well, 543 attempted crossings isn't very much relative to the total asylum claims we have every year. But the problem is this, and this is the real issue. This is a very dangerous way to try and enter the UK. It is incredibly dangerous. This is one of the busiest sea lanes in the world, and often these people will travel at night with no lights, often no life jackets, taking an incredibly dangerous journey, not just putting their life at risk, but also putting the life at risk of those that rescue them, such as the RNLI and others. And it is that danger, the danger that this represents, which requires us to take more action, and one of the reasons, alongside protecting the border, that this is a major incident. I don't think anyone in this House would want to be in a position knowing that the government has not done everything that it reasonably can to protect human life as well as protect our borders. And can I gently say this to the Right Honourable Lady, is that I know that she means well, I know that she values human life as much as anyone else in this House. Please do not use this as some kind of political football. This is about protecting human life and protecting our borders. And then the Right Honourable Lady, let me turn to the other questions she's raised about the first safe country principle. I mean, the Right Honourable Lady mentioned the 1951 Refugee Convention. The principle of first safe country is well established and widely accepted in international law. It is something the Prime Minister herself referred to in her speech at the UN General Assembly last year. It is a principle that is indirectly supported through the new Global Compact for Migration and the Global Compact for Refugees. And it is indeed a principle that was legally accepted by UNHCR when it explicitly recognised the concept in their paper that set out the legal precedent on the agreement between the EU and with Turkey. And very importantly, it is a principle that is at the heart of the EU's own common European asylum system. In the 2005 Procedures Directive, it is explicitly stated that an asylum seeker should claim asylum in their first safe country, otherwise it can be declared inadmissible if it's claimed in another country. That is repeated in the 2004 Qualification Directive, and it is also a principle that underpins the Dublin Regulation. The whole point of the Dublin Regulation is if you have passed through an EU, another EU safe country, then it is expected that you claim asylum first there. So that is a principle that I hope that she would support, notwithstanding that it was also embedded in the domestic legislation passed in 2004 by a Labour government, and I understand she did not vote against that act herself. And then lastly, the Right Honourable Lady asked me about other activities that the boats that I've asked to come back to the UK that they're involved in. The activities that they're involved in are very important. We will still be involved in international activities and humanitarian support, and I believe that we can balance both requirements domestically and internationally in the way we have set out plans, and the Royal Navy is supporting whilst we're filling the gap until those boats return.
Can I just say, it's a very important statement, but please can we show a little bit of brevity? It was an important question. I know that we wanted a very full answer, but it was much longer than I would have expected. So please, can we have brevity in both questions and answers, please? Ian Duncan-Smith.
Mr Deputy Speaker, can I say to my right honourable friend, I think he is absolutely right to stress the safety and security of these people who try this most dangerous crossing. And having given that, he's also right, I think, in saying that it is quite right for people to claim asylum in the first safe country that they come to, and France is clearly that, for one very good reason, that if they don't do that, they will live in squalor while they seek to get across the channel at the same time, putting their own lives at risk. Can I ask him, has he checked and has his office checked how long many of these people trying to cross have actually spent their time without declaring themselves as asylum seekers in France?
Yeah, I agree very much with my honourable friend and the point that he made. It's not possible to always get a definitive answer in terms of checking that, and many of these people are using France as a transit country, but they have typically, in many cases, entered perhaps through another EU country. But the principle itself is very important, and those that encourage people not to claim asylum in the first safe country are actually encouraging them to take this dangerous journey, and they should reflect on that.
Stuart C. Michael.
Thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker. Can I thank, first of all, the Home Secretary for advance sight of the statement and concur wholeheartedly with what both he and the Shadow Secretary said in relation to the attack at Manchester's Victoria Station. Mr Deputy Speaker, that around 500 individuals have been so desperate as to risk an incredibly dangerous journey across the Channel last year is probably better described as a human tragedy than a major incident. But in response, firstly, of course we must stop the organised crime gangs who are encouraging these perilous journeys. The Home Secretary mentioned 2 arrests, but how many does he estimate to be involved in facilitating these crossings, and does he anticipate further arrests and charges in the days ahead? Secondly, we must above all protect lives, and can he just confirm that that is the clear and unambiguous duty of all the ships being deployed to the Channel, and can also share the concerns raised by the Shadow Home Secretary about the implications of withdrawing 2 ships from operations on the Mediterranean, and can he say a little bit more about what that means in terms of what we're able to achieve there? Thirdly, Mr Deputy Speaker, we must properly, fairly and independently consider each claim for asylum made on arrival and treat all with dignity and respect. And it is here, unfortunately, that the Home Secretary has caused most concern in recent days, despite his more moderate language in his statement. He reportedly said that real, genuine asylum seekers wouldn't make such crossings, and spoke of a need to send a very strong message that you won't succeed if you make it to UK shores. Mr Deputy Speaker, that approach is factually, legally and morally wrong. And it's actually pretty insulting to many refugees who have contributed to this country, who did in fact make their way here through other safe countries for a whole host of legitimate reasons. And as the Home Secretary knows, the success rates in asylum applications from Iranians is particularly high.
Yeah, that's right.
So will the Home Secretary retract those remarks and confirm that all asylum applications will be considered solely on the basis of the Refugee Convention and whether the applicant is a refugee or not, and without any thought of sending messages? And will he take a humane and compassionate approach to the issue of possible third country removals instead of tightening laws, because otherwise he will simply be prolonging the misery?
Home Secretary.
Mr Speaker, first of all, again, the honourable gentleman has challenged, as the right honourable lady did, why is this a major incident? By declaring something a major incident, it allows us to bring more focus, more control and more resources. It's a well-established procedure within government, and again, that is something I hope the whole House can support, because by bringing us more resources, as well as protecting our borders, it allows us to protect more human life. If one life was lost, it's one life too many in this situation. I'm sure the honourable gentleman would agree. The jobs of the vessels that are currently there, joined by the Royal Navy vessel and to be joined by other vessels, of course, if they come across any situation where any life is in danger in any way, their first duty is to protect life, but at the same time, that is not their sole duty. Their duty is also to protect the border, and in this case, they will be working with the technology and the equipment that they have, with the support of the aerial surveillance, and with the joint cooperation with the French Navy and French vessels to both protect borders, including returning people and in many cases returning them back to the French coast with the help of the French authorities. The honourable gentleman then lastly mentioned my comments that I had made earlier last week about genuine asylum seekers, and I absolutely stand by those comments. You know, our job is to protect and help genuine asylum seekers, and it shouldn't be a shock to the honourable gentleman, but there are people that sometimes claim asylum asylum that are not genuine asylum seekers. And if we are to do more to protect those that really deserve it, then we should absolutely focus our resources on them, and those that could claim asylum in another safe country and have every opportunity to do so should be encouraged to do so.
Sir Nicholas Soames.
Mr Deputy Speaker, may I congratulate my right honourable friend the Home Secretary on the calm and assured way in which he has conducted and dealt with this very difficult matter. May I ask him if he is absolutely satisfied that throughout the camps and the assembly areas that these poor people use in France, that they are actually aware that if they come here and they make this terrible crossing, if they are not entitled to be here, they will be returned. I think that is very important. And secondly, may I suggest to him that, having prized an offshore patrol vessel from the Royal Navy, may I suggest to him that the Navy have a lot of very underused assets called URNUs, University Reserve Naval Units, who have boats which are grossly underused, Archer-class patrol vessels. He could easily have them, if he needs more boats, he could easily have them equipped with regular naval staff and used to great effect.
Secretary.
Can I thank my honourable friend for his suggestions, and we are working closely with the MOD. But on his first point, yes, we are sending, and including by this statement today, a very clear message. If you have passed through a safe country, and that of course includes France, then we would seek to make your claim inadmissible, and you should think twice about taking that journey, and do not give your money to these people smugglers, these vile criminals, and do not take this dangerous journey if you are seeking protection. Seek protection in the first safe country that you can.
Yvette Cooper.
I'd like the Home Secretary to just clarify what he just said. Is he seriously saying that he wants to make all claims for asylum, first claims of asylum in this country, inadmissible if people have travelled through another country first? He will know that people often travel because they have family in this country and because existing family reunion provisions are not working effectively, and also that we are bound by international law. Is he seriously saying he wants to rip up our obligations under the Refugee Convention and under international law? And does he realise the shame that that would bring on our country if he were to do so?
Home Secretary.
Well, let me be clear with the right honourable lady. I'm not saying that at all. What I am saying is, of course, I am not saying that, and I will clarify that every claim, of course, will be assessed on its own merits. But the point I am making is about the first safe country principle, which is a principle that is well established. And I mentioned earlier, when I responded to the right honourable lady from the Shadow Home Secretary, a number of the international agreements, including through the concept that's now been accepted by the UNHCR, but indeed even through European rules which apply to us through the Common European Asylum System, in the Procedures Directive, the Qualification Directive, is a well-established principle. And actually in those directives themselves, backed up by the Dublin Regulation, it requires individuals to, for example, if I quote the 2005 Procedures Directive, Articles 25 and 26, they cover the principles of first safe country and inadmissibility of claims where people have travelled through safe countries. And indeed, the 2004 Immigration Act, which is obviously domestic legislation, which again clearly sets out that failure to take advantage of a reasonable opportunity to claim asylum in a safe country shall be taken into account assessing an individual's credibility, an act that the right honourable lady voted for.
Mitchell.
Mr Deputy Speaker, the heart-rending plight of those caught out in the Channel, often having placed themselves into the hands of the modern-day equivalent of the slave trader, rightly worries us all. But surely, Mr Deputy Speaker, the Home Secretary is right to say that inevitably nearly all of them will not be correctly classified as asylum seekers under the Dublin Convention. Is it not clear that the closest possible cooperation with the French is required to ensure that these poor people do not end up on the high seas?
Home Secretary.
Mr. Deputy Speaker, my right honourable friend makes a number of good points, but particularly this issue around cooperation with the French. And we have, thankfully, during the course of last year in particular, seen very good cooperation with the French, and much of that was codified under the Sandhurst Treaty. And given this recent situation, we are seeing good cooperation, including with the announcement the French themselves made on last week on Friday. But he's absolutely right to point out this issue. The more that we can work together with the French to stop these crossings in the first place, the better protection these people will have from the dangerous journey.
Kate Green.
Taking something into account is not the same as seeking to make it inadmissible. Can the Home Secretary confirm which it is that he means? Yes.
Home Secretary.
Mr. Deputy Speaker, I think both are consistent. They don't cancel each other out. You can take something into account because you are seeking to make it inadmissible.
Ray Manchester.
Mr. Deputy Speaker, the Home Secretary knows that I raised this specific issue about illegal migrants coming to Kent in November when he came before the Home Affairs Select Committee. Then there was around 100 individuals, 13 boats. In December there was over 95 individuals. The Home Secretary said there was a joint coordination centre with France and that would resolve issues to a certain extent. Is the Home Secretary saying that joint coordination centre did not work, or were additional resources required and linked to that? The 2 additional cutters, I very much welcome that. They're coming from Gibraltar and Greece. When will they arrive and do what they need to do? And will their place be taken by our international counterparts? Because they also have a responsibility to ensure that those coming in from North Africa Gulf are deterred from coming in the first place.
Yeah. Home Secretary.
Mr. Deputy Speaker, I can tell my honourable friend that first of all he mentioned the joint, the UK-France joint coordination centre, which has now opened in Calais. It's not a question about it doesn't work. It actually is making a very important contribution to this, but it's not enough on its own, and that work needed to be supplemented, and that's why we've taken further action in recent weeks. So that includes, of course, working much more closely with the French on disruptions. As I mentioned earlier, of all the crossings we know about, just over 40% have been successfully disrupted by the French, and also stepping up law enforcement coordination. The French themselves have also recently made a number of arrests, and also better coordination of maritime patrols and better shared intelligence, which is exactly what we're doing.
David Hanson.
Could the Home Secretary tell the House how many convictions there have been of people traffickers in the past 12 months? And given that intelligence-led policing is key to those convictions, could the Home Secretary tell the House what use was made by authorities of SIS2, of Europol, and ultimately in bringing people to justice, Eurojust and the European arrest warrant?
Home Secretary.
The law enforcement work is a very important part of this operation. So since April 2018, the law enforcement authority in the UK have disrupted 46 organised criminal gangs involved in people smuggling. So, for example, in November 2018, 2 men were jailed for 8 years each for that. In September 2018, 7 members of an OCG were jailed for sentences totalling 48 years. And in February of last year, 2 men were jailed for over 9 years.
Sir Desmond Swayne.
He was previously cautious about increasing the number of patrols because, perversely, it might lead to an increase in the number of attempts. Why has he changed his mind?
Home Secretary.
I think it's a very good question, Mr. Deputy Speaker, and it's important to keep under constant review how we have a limited number of vessels for Border Force. They have a great deal of work to do, not just in the UK, but in terms of the international operations. So what I had done was ask for advice on redeployment, and when I received that advice and I was comfortable that they could meet both their international obligations and also prioritise the UK border, I made a decision, and that was what was implemented.
Trevor David.
Rather than denigrating refugees fleeing from the despicable Iranian regime for not claiming asylum elsewhere, can the Home Secretary tell this House how many asylum seekers we've been able to return to other EU countries under the EU Dublin regulation in the last 3 years? Is he concerned that in the Brexit deal before the House there is no guarantee that the UK will retain that power?
Home Secretary.
Mr. Deputy Speaker, the right honourable gentleman just really should stop using this as some kind of political game. These are people's lives that we're talking about. And this government, as much as any other government before it, cares about these people's lives. And that's why I talked earlier about the aid that we provide in region, over $2.7 billion to help Syrian refugees, more than any other single country. The refugee resettlement programs that this country has, that I know the Right Honourable Gentleman supports as well, where we have resettled in 2017 more refugees than any other single EU state. So rather than trying to score cheap political points with this, he should join us and try to help these people.
David Collins.
You just come and agree, and as the whole House does, that our priority should be stopping these crossings in the first place. I welcome what he said about the increase in surveillance, both by air, on the sea and on land in France as well. Nevertheless, this morning a vessel left France and landed at Dungeness in my constituency, which the Home Secretary knows is often a very particularly treacherous part of the coast. Can he assure me what more needs to be done to make sure that boats aren't slipping through the net? Because in this case, the vessel was detected by a local fishing craft who alerted the authorities and wasn't first spotted by the authorities themselves.
Home Secretary.
Yeah, thank you. Can I thank my honourable friend for that? And he refers to the events this morning in his constituency. And whilst I can't say too much about that, it's an ongoing operation, he may know that an arrest has been made in relation to that as well today. But he's absolutely right about doing more on detection. And that is work both with the Border Force, with the Coast Guard, now with the help of the Royal Navy, but also, very importantly, with French and the French authorities. We have, despite the news the Honourable Gentleman shared with us, we have seen a significant fall in the overall number of crossings over the last 7 days. And we can't take too much from that, but we hope that the law enforcement work that's being done and the detection work is actually contributing to bringing overall crossings down.
Cavan Jones.
Kind of very clear, I support that we do need clear border security, but what is lacking in the Secretary of State's statement is actual figures. He talks about attempts, but can he actually say how many people actually arrived here, claimed asylum, and have claimed asylum over the three-month period? And if he's not got those to hands, could he perhaps put them in the library of the House, along with the numbers of others that have come through other routes to this country in that same period?
Home Secretary.
Mr Deputy Speaker, I'm happy to share some figures with the Honourable Gentleman that I have with me now. And the figures we have is that in 2018, 543 people made the attempt across the Channel, but 42% of those attempts, that's I think that 227 people, were intercepted. So therefore, 316 arrived in the UK in 2018, and most of those were in the last 3 months of the year.
Asylum seeking, and they would regard it as outrageous that somebody can come to this country and claim asylum having travelled through 1, 2, 3 or many more safe countries on the way. So I, for one, speaking on behalf of my constituents, would welcome the government getting tough on this. Let's enforce the Dublin Conventions and let's have joint maritime patrols with the French so that when these people are caught mid-channel, they can be returned to French ports.
Home Secretary.
Mr Deputy Speaker, my honourable friend makes a very important point, and I think most of our constituents across the country would agree with his on this issue. He mentioned the issue of joint patrols. We are working with the French, and it has stepped up in recent weeks, about what more that we can do together, and the new coordination centre is certainly helping in that regard.
Liz Saville-Roberts.
Over Christmas, my colleague, Assembly Member Leanne Wood, was contacted by Robin Jenkins, a Welsh RNLI lifeboatman. He was a crew member on Sea-Watch 3, which rescued 32 people, including women, children and a baby, off the coast of Malta on the 22nd of December. The 50-metre vessel has now been in limbo at sea for 17 days, denied a safe harbour throughout Mediterranean Europe. The British government has so far refused any direct support despite requests, even though these people are unable to claim asylum in any country because they are not allowed to land. Will the Minister today outline what he is doing to encourage EU member states and, of course, UK territories and resources in the Mediterranean to show common humanity to these people?
Home Secretary.
Mr Deputy Speaker, first of all, can I take this opportunity to thank all members of the RNLI for the work that they have done, especially in recent weeks with regard to this increase in crossings. As we all know, they are volunteers, they are incredibly courageous, they put their own lives at risk, and I want to put on record our gratitude for all the work they do. She's raised a specific case. I'm not sure from what the Honourable Lady said whether it's a Home Office or a Foreign Office case, but we're happy to take a further look.
Jeremy Lafroy.
Thank you very much, Mr Deputy Speaker. Can I welcome the Home Secretary's announcement, but can I ask him to explain what cooperation the UK is giving to our European partners, not just in France, but in Italy, Greece and Spain and Malta, which have borne a very heavy responsibility for rescuing and providing safe haven to refugees. Can we hear more about that, please?
Home Secretary.
Yes, I'm very happy to share that, some further details with my honourable friend. We are providing help to our European friends in a number of ways with the huge increase that they've seen in refugee and asylum seekers since 2015. So, for example, through Op Poseidon, which is in the Aegean, we have been called out, our border force vessels and our crew there, in over 700 missions, and we have saved over 15,000 lives through that operation. We are also working closely with our friends in Greece. We have provided personnel and advice and funding, and we will continue to work with our friends in Europe to see what more we can do.
Stella Creasy.
Thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker. I want to say the most terrible thing about the Home Secretary's English Channel photo shoot is his willful misreading of decades of asylum legislation we were proud of in this country. But actually the most terrible thing is that nothing he said today will stop the traffickers, which is what we all want to see happening. There are 1,500 people sleeping rough tonight around Dunkirk and Calais. 250 of them are children, unaccompanied minors. They speak 28 different languages. They're not just from Iran, they're from the Yemen, they're from Ethiopia. They're from countries around the world fleeing persecution. There have been 972 human rights abuses reported in Calais, 244 involving police violence. The Home Secretary says that he's there with the police when the French police want to make disruptive measures. They're pouring bleach into the tents of these refugees. If, as he says he does, he cares about these people, he will spend less time on Twitter talking to the alt-right and more time out in Calais working out how we deal with this humanitarian crisis now. Hear, hear.
Mr Deputy Speaker, I'm afraid I don't accept that description of the Honourable Lady's painting of France at all. France is a good partner. It is a perfectly safe country, as are many other European countries. What the Honourable Lady should think about very carefully is that she is indirectly encouraging these people to get into these small boats and to cross the channel, and that will put more lives at risk. Think very carefully about what you're saying and what you're encouraging.
Maggie Throop.
Deputy Speaker, my honourable friend quite rightly described how dangerous the crossing is. So can he confirm what more he's doing to work with the authorities, not just in France, but in other appropriate nations, to tackle the root cause of the problem so people these vulnerable people don't have to attempt the crossing in the first place?
Mr Deputy Speaker, there is much action, I can tell my honourable friend, that is taking place across government departments, especially through the Department for International Aid, to tackle some of the root causes of the increase in migration that we've seen across Europe. Central to that is the help to Syria and more broadly to the Middle East and parts of North Africa. As I said, billions of pounds, almost £3 billion of humanitarian funding, making the UK the largest single donor to the region, and that support is helping with infrastructure, with education, and also other types of humanitarian support to try and prevent people from taking these dangerous journeys and working with people smugglers in the first place.
Martin Doherty.
Good to see you in the chair, Mr Deputy Speaker, and a Happy New Year to you. The Home Secretary has not been shy in trying to make their mark over the Christmas recess, Mr Deputy Speaker, because before the announcement of this migration emergency, they made headlines commenting on this government's intention to protect the rights of Christians, persecuted Christians abroad. Given that many of those who are now taking to the boats and are now at peril on the sea appear themselves to be Iranian Christians from Iran, does the Home Secretary therefore see no contradiction in committing to protect those persecuted Christians abroad while telling them there's no room at the inn in the UK?
Mr Deputy Speaker, I'm not sure if the honourable gentleman has been listening to what the government policy is, how we will continue to assess each individual application, but it is a widely accepted principle that if you are fleeing persecution, that you should claim asylum in the first safe country that you are in.
Matt Warburton. Because such is the desperation and commitment of some refugees that they are even crossing the North Sea and landing in small boats in Lincolnshire, in both East Lindsey and in Boston. I pay tribute to the work of Lincolnshire Police and to the Border Force in dealing with this difficult and largely unpopulated coast. Will the Home Secretary agree with me, however, that we not only need to look at the real hotspots that have arisen very recently, but we also do need to look at the east coast of England as well?
Yes, I very much agree with my honourable friend. He will know, and no doubt it's one of the reasons he's rightly raised this issue. There has been a landing on the coast in Lincolnshire. We believe it was in December, and it's being closely looked at, but he's right that we need to be looking wider than just the south east coast.
Thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker. Given that this is a time of unprecedented global refugee crisis and the vast majority of refugees end up in countries adjacent to the country of their country of origin, a small minority only come to this country, and I agree with the Home Secretary, we want to protect and save lives, can the Home Secretary please tell us how many border officers he has sent to Calais to process people who have a claim to family reunion, what he's doing to increase the number taken under family resettlement, that's safe and legal route that allows people out of an overburdened country next to a country of war to this country, and what else he's doing so that we can take our fair share of the world's responsibility for this global refugee crisis.
Mr Deputy Speaker, I'm sure the honourable lady will know, but we do a great deal, and this government is successive previous governments. We have done a great deal to help refugees across the world. We have the Vulnerable Children's Refugee Settlement Scheme, the Vulnerable Persons Resettlement Scheme. We also actively will work with our European partners to reunite families, particularly children. In fact, one of the first acts I took as Home Secretary last summer was to ensure that unaccompanied refugee children brought in through the UK from Calais, that they would have established a new right to stay to make it easier for them to do that, and we will continue to meet our obligations on family reunion, which are in the Dublin regulation. In fact, just a couple of months ago, unlike many other countries, we were the first, alongside Canada, to help the White Helmets, the former White Helmets, who were facing certain death under Assad in Syria, and we took over 25 White Helmets individuals alongside their family, almost 100 people, and we provided them with protection because that goes to our values and just the kind of country that we are.
Bristol.
Thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker. I welcome the decisive action the Home Secretary has taken. Under the European Union's Dublin regulations, asylum seekers should claim asylum in the first safe country they reach. I think both sides of the House agree that we want to deter people from making this dangerous journey. Isn't the best way to do that to make sure that where people are intercepted in the English Channel, they're returned to the French shoreline from whence they embarked? And if we do that, it removes the incentive for attempting the crossing in the first place.
Mr Deputy Speaker, we are working closely with our French friends in disrupting more of the boats from setting out in the first place, and where they are currently detected in French waters, they are returned back to France. We are also working with France using our own detection systems which reach out into French waters to see if we can do more to work with them to return more. But the safest thing here is really to as well as returning boats, is to work on those criminal gangs as well that are feeding on these vulnerable people, and to make sure that no one sets out on this journey in the first place.
Paul Sweeney.
Thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker. Is the Home Secretary aware of the United Kingdom's obligations under the 1951 United Nations Convention on Refugees, and indeed that there is no legal obligation for asylum seekers to seek asylum in the first safe country they arrive in? That does not exist in the body of international law. And also, would it not be a much better use of this government's resources if they were actually engaged in the French mainland, looking after some of those terribly abandoned unaccompanied child minors who we promised to take in, the 3,000 we promised to take in? Where has the resources been devoted to disrupting the incentive to come over the Channel in an unsafe way by actually processing and understanding the needs of those people on the French coast?
Mr Deputy Speaker, we remain absolutely committed to the 1951 Refugee Convention, and that will not change. The principle that I have set out today, which is widely established and accepted, is the principle of first safe country. It is the interest of those asylum seekers that they don't continue what might be a dangerous journey and seek asylum in the first safe country. And the honourable gentleman is asking me if I'm aware of the convention. I wonder if he's aware of the UK's own domestic laws and regulation from 2004, which represents the will of this House, which clearly underlines the importance of claiming asylum in the first safe country that you are in.
Simon. Mr Speaker, and my constituents would certainly want me to say that anyone coming illegally to the UK from a safe country like France should certainly be returned. And does my right honourable friend agree with me that one of the most compelling reasons behind the first safe country principle is precisely to prevent people from being incentivised to undertake those dangerous crossings?
Mr Deputy Speaker, I absolutely agree with my honourable friend, and that really goes to the heart of this, is that this is all about protecting lives, protecting vulnerable people, and if they feel that for whatever reason, perhaps because they've been sold a false prospectus by people smugglers, that they can't claim asylum in a safe country that they're in, then ultimately they are the ones that are going to be hurt, and we must all do what we can to prevent that.
I'll listen to this.
Mr Deputy Speaker, does the Home Secretary not understand that it's precisely because these people are so desperate that they will take these risks, that they will undertake these dangers to travel in boats to come to the UK? They are precisely doing that because those safe routes that they ought to have failed. Safety is relative, Mr Deputy Speaker, and I certainly feel safest when I'm with my family. Can you tell me how many of the people that were picked up in these boats have family in the UK and how quickly he will be able to process their applications?
Mr Deputy Speaker, the honourable lady said that or suggested that these people are not able to seek asylum in other safe countries. France, for example, is a perfectly safe country, and if these people are fleeing persecution, then it is to their advantage that they claim asylum in the first safe country that they are in, and they are not encouraged to take dangerous journeys.
Brother.
Thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker. My right honourable friend made a very important point which the Home Secretary has so far ignored. When will he admit the very telling impact of the government's austerity policies on this serious problem, and when will he report to the House to let us know what further resources are being allocated to help?
Good.
Mr Deputy Speaker, if the honourable gentleman is suggesting that the reason these boat crossings are taking place is because of UK government spending, it's just plainly ridiculous.
Emma Harvey.
Thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker. Could the Home Secretary explain how successful he found exploiting the acts of desperate and vulnerable refugees, misrepresenting conventions and stirring up hatred in his own personal ambition to become the next leader of the Conservative Party?
Mr Deputy Speaker, only serious questions deserve an answer.
Luke Pollard.
Thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker. I've been to Calais and I've spoken to unaccompanied child refugees. I've spoken to child refugees in Plymouth. They all want a better life. But this major incident has left many of them in fear. When refugee stories like this appear in the media, there is a real fear that hate rises, because hate does rise. Violence towards refugees in our country rises. So can the Home Secretary be absolutely clear that nobody, especially those on the right, the far right in particular, should use this incident to stir up hate and division in our communities that seek to put even more fear and a tougher time on people that have suffered so much already?
Mr. Deputy Speaker, of course there is no room for hate in this country, whether it's refugees, it's migrants, or for any other reason. And that's why I think it's even more important that we treat protection that we offer to others. It's a very precious thing, and that we make the system as fair as possible, and we do all that we can to discourage people, in this case, from taking these dangerous journeys and also working with these people smugglers. And that's the whole intention of the policy that the government has set in place, and I hope the honourable gentleman can support it.
Drew Hendry. Your Lumreek, Mr Deputy Speaker. The Home Secretary has pointed out himself earlier on that there are diverse reasons why people might be attempting this treacherous journey across the Channel, yet he refuses to acknowledge the fact that some of them might be trying to be reunited with their families. Can he tell us what progress has been made in supporting the family reunion bill brought forward by my honourable friend from Naheil and Anana?
Well, Mr. Deputy Speaker, under the Dublin regulation, it takes account of family reunion and the need within the European member states of family reunion when it comes to successful asylum applications, and indeed pending asylum applications. We take part in that actively because we can see that, and that is also another reason. If someone is in France and the reason that they're wanting to come to the UK is because of family connections, they need not take that treacherous journey. There's a system within the Dublin regulation that exists for family reunion.
We come to the statement. Secretary of State for Transport.
Thank you, Mr. Deputy Speaker. With your permission, I'd like to make a statement about the action the government is taking on our future policy on drones. And let me start